Get your free copy of the complete tutorial at www.teachucomp.com/free.
Macros are small programs that record your keystrokes as you perform a task and then save the actions you performed as a Visual Basic module, which is a type of program file. When you run the macro later, it will repeat your keystrokes and thus repeat your actions. This is why they are great for automating repetitive tasks. For example, assume you wanted to place your name and your company's information in the upper left cell of a worksheet. You could use a macro to record your keystrokes as you create it once, and then run the macro in the future to repeat the exact same keystrokes you entered. This lets you instantaneously repeat the same process again. While you can see advanced options for creating macros on the Developer tab in the ribbon if it is enabled, you can also use the Macros button group that appears on the View tab within the ribbon to record and play back basic macros. In this lesson, we will examine how to record a basic macro using the commands found within this button group in the ribbon. To begin to record a macro, click the Macros drop-down button that appears in the Macros button group in the View tab in the ribbon. From the drop-down menu that appears, select the Record Macro command to open the Record Macro dialog box. In the Record Macro dialog box, enter a name for the new macro into the Macro Name text box. Macro names cannot contain spaces. Next, select the name of the workbook to which you want to attach the macro by selecting its name from the Store Macro in dropdown. If you do not change it, it will default to saving the macro into the current workbook. This is important because a macro can only be run if it is attached to an open workbook or stored in the Personal Macro workbook, which we will discuss later. To create a custom keyboard shortcut to use in conjunction with the Control key, type the desired shortcut key letter into the text box next to the Control Plus label. If you decide to do this, make sure you don't overwrite an existing shortcut. For example, the shortcut character of P would be a bad choice, as Control plus P is already a keyboard shortcut for the print command. If you aren't familiar with the keyboard shortcuts, it may be better if you don't assign one. When you're ready to start recording your actions, click OK. While recording your macro, you cannot use your mouse very much, and you should minimize your mouse movements during the recording of the macro. Instead, try to use the keyboard as much as possible. Unlike macros and other Microsoft Office programs, the types of cell references you make in Excel while recording a macro can be adjusted. For example, assume that when you began recording your macro, your active cell was cell A1. From there, you clicked into cell D1. When Excel records you doing that, it can either record that action as a relative reference or as an absolute reference. That action, if recorded using relative references, would make the active cell move 4 cells to the right of whatever cell it was in when you started to play back the macro. If you recorded it in absolute terms, it would always move to cell D1 from wherever cell you had selected as the active cell when you started to play the macro. To enable relative cell referencing when recording a macro, click the Macros drop-down button in the Macros button group and choose the Use Relative References command to turn it on. By default, Excel macros will use absolute references. To switch back to absolute cell referencing when recording a macro, you would simply click the Macros drop-down button in the Macros button group again and select the Use Relative References command again to turn it back off. After recording the macro, you simply click the Macros drop-down button in the Macros button group and select the Stop Recording command to stop recording the macro. Also remember that if you want to save a workbook that contains macros in Excel, you need to select the Excel Macro Enabled Workbook choice from the File Type drop-down within the Save As dialog box.
Like what you see? Pick up your free copy of the complete tutorial at www.teachucomp.com/free.